we are going to cover everything that you need to know about the 1950 census. And that is actually turns out to be kind of a lot. So we're going to just jump into it and introduce you to it, kind of show you what you should be looking for, what you're going to find, what you can do now. In fact, at the end, I've got 5 important things that you can be doing right now as a genealogy researcher to prepare and actually make some headway before the 1950 census comes out. So let's jump into it. I love the 1950s, and there was a lot happening in the United States at that time, and the census certainly captured so much of it. The census, generally speaking, is really kind of the backbone of genealogy research, isn't it? It gives us that opportunity to see our families and our relatives and our ancestors in family groups, which is wonderful. It's not just an individual on a record, but it's them in the context of their family, your family. And that helps you find your way back through time. So they started back in 1790, the U.S. federal census did, and it was taken every 10 years. So that's a really nice snapshot. When you're covering a couple of centuries, it's really great to be able to go in and take a look at these family groups decade by decade. Now, currently, you've got public access to the U.S. Census from 1790 all the way through 1940. And those of you who have been at genealogy for a while remember the excitement of the 1940 census being released. Well, what are you going to find out in 1950? It's going to be able to answer, I hope, some questions for you, like where was your family living in 1950? And hey, did you have any American relatives living abroad? Because this time around, they were captured in the census. What did your relatives do for a living? That's kind of fun to find out. And what was their household income? Those are just a couple of the things. And we're going to show you the form. We're going to show you all the different types of information you're going to be able to gather from the 1950 census. Now, this census also really stands out because it ushered in some really new features when it came to data collection and particularly improvements. And their goal, of course, which I'm sure was the goal every time, but they really made some strides in 1950, was to be more complete and more accurate. And that's music to our ears, isn't it? Because if you have been researching for a while, you have probably been in one of the census records and just been unable to put your hands on a family or person that you were sure should have been there. And there's lots of reasons for that, but sometimes it's just human error, or it's just how complicated it is to take the census. So in 1950, they were really striving to improve that and to capture as many people as accurately as they could. So the beauty of this is that these new records from 1950 are going to hopefully help you confirm some of those things that you already know. I know I've got stuff that I'm looking forward to just kind of checking the box. I've got another piece of evidence that backs up what I thought was true. But also, hey, if it's a new record collection, it's going to provide you with some new clues and new information. And we don't want to just stop there, do we? We want to be able to take that and say, now I know what I'm looking for, and go find more evidence that backs it up or maybe expands that information. You know, there's only so much they could capture on a census form, so we want to make the most of it. So let's dig into the 1950 census, okay? Hold your horses. It's not available yet. I hate to break that to you, but if you're new to genealogy, you may not realize that it's not out yet, but that's okay. There's a lot you can do because, hey, this party is just around the corner. It's April of 2022, and there's a lot that we can do right now. You know, when you're going to get into any kind of new area of research, it's so important to really get familiar with that record collection, understand what was happening with it, because we can make a lot of false assumptions when we look at that information and we interpret it if we're not really getting what's going on and who's taking down this information and why is this happening, right? So to prepare for the party, to get your corsage pinned on, we need to cover some of the basics and show you what to look for. Because it's never too soon to get acquainted with an important genealogical record like this. And it is coming out from the National Archives in just under a year. In fact, April 1st, which was last week as the time of this recording, was exactly 1 year to go. And of course, it's not all going to just be instantly available on April 1st, particularly with the pandemic going on. The National Archives has certainly had a lot of closures because of that. We have to kind of bear that in mind. But generally speaking, we are pretty much exactly 1 year from the release of the records. And that's 72 years. April 1st of 2021 was 72 years. Well, no, that's 2022. It's getting confusing, isn't it? April 1st of 2022 is exactly 72 years from the official census date in 1950, which was April 1st of 1950. And that brings us to the dreaded 72-year rule. Okay, so why do we have to wait 72 years before we get our hands on a public record like the U.S. Census? Back in 1978, they made a law, and I've got a reference for you, and it's in the show notes for this episode. So it was this law passed on October 5th of 1978, and it restricts access to the decennial census records to only the person who's named on the record or their legal heir. So if for some reason you have a legal proceeding or reason to need to verify something from 1950 and you can prove you're a legal heir, you could get access sooner. But generally speaking, that's not the case for most of us. So the 72-year rule means that the 1940 census that we got a little while back was released on April 2nd of 2012. And that means we're going to get the 1950 in 2022. So how did this 72-year thing happen? There's always a lot of question about that. And there's a lot of people who would like to see that get shortened up. I can appreciate that. A lot of times the assumption is that it was based on life expectancy, but that actually may not be really the case. It kind of sounds logical, 72 years. But in the show notes, I'm going to have a link to an essay that Joel Weintraub did several years ago. And he talked about the fact that really it appeared to have evolved from when the National Archives was created. Now, I did some digging over at the census.gov and the National Archives, and there are some letters from the Census Bureau director and the National Archivist, and they're talking about it in the 1950s. In 1952, there's kind of an exchange, but they don't actually say why 72 years. And Joel's proposal on this idea was that in 1942, when they finally got the National Archives up and running, they decided to release 1790 through 1870, those census records. They had them. There was no mention of, copyright or promises to the public, and so they made them available. Well, that happened to be 72 years since the 1870 census. And even then, we don't know for sure if there was discussion, we should wait the life expectancy. Here's the bottom line. You got to wait 72 years. Sorry. But that means that 1950 census is just around the corner. So in preparation for using the 1950 census, there are some things that you need to know, and particularly when it comes to using it for genealogy research. So first, we need to understand who was counted during the 1950 census. Because in addition to Americans that were living here in the United States, in the continental United States, which was 48 states at the time, because Hawaii and Alaska were still territories at that time. They counted the people in the 48 states. They also counted members of the armed forces, crews on vessels at sea, and employees of the U.S. government, and their families if they were living abroad. So if any of your ancestors happen to fall in any of these categories, you've got a lot more to look forward to in the 1950 census. But you still have to be aware that there were still other people living abroad that were not included. Okay, they didn't fall neatly into those categories. In those cases, they were reported by their families or even their neighbors who happened to be living in the U.S. So what does that mean? It's secondhand information. We think of that as primary and secondary sources. This falls in the secondary or thirdly category. Is that a term? It's secondhand, which means it's not as reliable. In fact, the Census Bureau decided not even to include the numbers on those people in their published statistics officially because they just weren't absolutely sure that that information was correct. So this is important to keep in mind. If you know that one of your ancestors might have been abroad in some form at that time and you're having a hard time finding them located, that might be the reason. So just keep that in mind. So this is the form, okay? Wow, has the U.S. Census form changed? Gone are the days where we just have a little tick mark and then eventually we got a name and an age, and every census, they add a little more detail. This form has a whole lot more. So what are you going to see? Things like their address, okay? Whether the house they're living in was on a farm or not. Of course, their name, their relationship to the head of the household. Typically speaking, the head of the household would be the husband, if there's a husband and there's a wife and there's kids. It could be a woman who's running a boarding house. There's a lot of, they'll basically establish whoever the head of the household is, and then each person is listed in terms of their relationship to that person. It'll cover race, sex, age, their marital status, their birthplace if they were foreign born, whether or not they were naturalized after they came to the United States, what their employment status was, how many hours they worked in a week, what their occupation and what the industry was that occupation fell within, and what class of worker they were. Okay, well, so now we kind of know who the people are that we're talking about and what they're going to be asked on the form. We need to talk a little bit about the geography of the 1950 census. It's fascinating to see the efforts that were made. Here's showing that they're working within the territory of Alaska and doing a census. That's a brave census taker. Okay, so geographically, what did this cover? The continental United States, right? Those 48 states, the territories of Alaska and Hawaii. So even though they're not states yet, they do fall within the 1950 census. Also, America, Samoa, the Canal Zone, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and some of the smaller territories within the U.S. So it covers more than just the basic United States, and that's good for all of us. That brings us to, when we talk about geography, this is really unlocking the key to the 1950 census, because the enumeration district maps are really going to be your key. And this is part of your homework before we get to April of 2022. So it takes a lot of census takers. They're called enumerators. And just to count 150 million people. So there were about half as many people in the United States in 1950 than there are today. So 150 million people, it still takes a lot of people. So this workforce had to be trained, right, to hopefully make fewer mistakes. So here was their plan in 1950. They had 26 chief enumerators, and they were going to teach a couple of hundred of their main instructors. Those people were going to go out and train about 8,300 crew leaders, and they were going to train the 140, which really I think ended up being about 143,000 census enumerators. So that's a lot of people. This came from the U.S. Census Bureau website, and I just think it's really interesting to see what it was taking at this point in American history to cover all of these people. Well, how did all of these enumerators, these 140,000, how do they know where to go? How do they make sure that they're not crossing paths with other enumerators or that somehow they've missed a neighborhood altogether? That's where enumeration districts come into play, and they're called EDs. We call them EDs. So enumeration districts. Now this is the geographic area that this one census taker is going to cover. And that's how they know what they're going to be doing. So it was designed, they drew out all these maps and they had to figure out, how can we assign each single census enumerator and make sure they're not crossing paths with other people so that this is their one area of responsibility, and that it has to be an area that they could cover completely in the 2 to 4 weeks that they were going to be working. So these were absolutely key. And you can imagine that the prep that had to go into this well before the census day of April 1st. So this is what an enumeration map looks like. And as you can see, the districts are drawn up in really detailed maps. They're kind of in color. If you've looked at the 1940 enumeration district maps, you know that those were, at least the ones I've looked at, are all in black and white drawings. So these are almost looking more, a little bit kind of like Sanborn fire insurance maps, if you're familiar with those. But it really gives us just one more glimpse into our ancestors' neighborhoods. And I think that's just kind of exciting. Now, we have to remember that these maps are designed specifically for the census. So we can't assume that numbers are necessarily house numbers, right? And the big numbers that you see in orange, those are the ED numbers, okay? And you'll find in the bottom of each map, there's going to be a key that will explain to you the colors that they're using. You can see we've got green lines on here and orange lines. Those are all explained in the legends or the keys of each of the maps. So, okay, an enumeration district drawn into detailed maps showing us our ancestors' neighborhood in 1950, how far along it has come. And you can, obviously, if you're familiar with the neighborhood, you'll see what's not there yet. And it really is the key. You need these in order to be prepared to find your ancestors in the 1950 census when it gets released. But the good news is ED maps don't fall within the 72-year rule. Yay! So that means you can have access to them now, okay? So we can start doing our homework today. And we have to keep in mind, it takes time for the census to be indexed. And it's got to get indexed to be searchable, right? We're so used to being able to go in and type in an ancestor's name and have them pop up in a census record. But that's not the experience we're going to have as soon as this gets released. So released means from the National Archives, here's the files. They're digitized, right? But that's it. You'll have to know where to go within them. There's no keyword searching, there's no name searching or anything. So the only way to really know, to be able to dig into those digitized files before they're indexed, is you've got to know what ED your ancestor is in at that time. And that's going to help you. Because there's over 8,000 enumeration district maps. Okay, so these are held primarily at the National Archives in the U.S. And they're part of Record Group 29. And it's a series. It's called Enumeration District and Related Maps, 1880 through 1990 series. Okay, so this episode, my friends, of the show, super important to get the show notes. The show notes are already done. Yes, I know. I'm always late. It's always a couple of days later. But I told Bill this week, I'm going to get these babies done before the show starts so people can go straight to them. As you're watching, after you're watching, you've got show notes. How do you get them? Okay, well, I have a video here on the Genealogy Gems channel called Show Notes, so you can watch that if you'd like to see step-by-step how to get there. But it's super easy. You go to my website, genealogygems.com, click Elevenses in the menu, or you can just do /Elevenses, and then click this episode. And there you're going to find all the notes. Absolutely everything I prepared for this video is written out for you. And if you're a premium member, you're going to have the downloadable ad-free PDF cheat sheet. Okay, so that's going to be very searchable for you too. So it's pretty long this time. It's really long. So this cheat sheet, you're going to want to be able to search within it, and you can do that as a premium member because you'll have the PDF. So I'll have a link in those show notes that are going to take you over to the enumeration district maps over the National Archives. This is what it looks like, as you can see on the screen. But there's an even better tool to find them, and that is Stephen Morse's one-step tool. Okay, it's at stephenmorse.org, not .com, .org, okay? So when you go there, you'll see this tool. Now, I want to show it to you in action because it's really cool. You go in and you select the state, okay? So if I know that my grandmother lived in California, and I'm going to go and pick her county, which was the San Joaquin County, and she lived in the city of Stockton. Okay, so this is the tool to find 1950 enumeration district maps. We're going to click the button, and you're going to see they're going to give us a link that will take us to the maps for this district, 75, which is the county, over at the National Archives. So if we click that link, that's going to take me straight to. I don't have to dig around that National Archives website, which is not that user-friendly. And I'm going to be able to go straight to these enumeration district maps for the city of Stockton in San Joaquin County. And you can kind of view them here. You can dig around and take a look, see if I can find her street, which was Arcade Street. You can also do the zoom in, zoom out. You can do full screen. And most importantly, download. So you can click the download button here at the National Archives website. Let it load. It's a big file because it's a really high resolution image. We're going to right click on it and save image as. So you can save this image as a JPEG to your computer hard drive. And I just find it's a lot easier to look at it in my viewer on my own computer than to try to maneuver ongoing and work with it over the National Archives. And that way it becomes part of your genealogy record collection. So back at stephenmorse.org, you'll notice that on the home page, if you look in the upper right left-hand corner, we see a lot of different categories, and we're going to be looking for census. So if you hover over census, now you can see there's a lot of different tools, and we open this folder up. And there's lots here. We couldn't possibly cover it all in this hour together, but I want to draw your attention to the Unified Census ED Finder. It covers 1880 to 1950. So notice that some of the things are crossed out. Don't worry about it. It's all about what you've pre-selected. So we have to go back in and select our state. This is if you have the address. So if you know, and I know the address of my grandmother, so I can go in and go back to California, San Joaquin. Once I click Stockton, this tool, the Unified Census ED Finder, can accept a house number. So first of all, they've got links to all of the different ED maps. I'm going to put in her house number, which is 21. And once I do that, I can go to the street and Arcade is listed. Notice it has brought it down to 3 links. This is wonderful. So I think if I look here, you know, there's 75. Now, if I saw different than 75, if I saw 76, it might be because you didn't select a county, because there'll be different county numbers. So if you're not sure of the county, or you think there's only one of those towns, that's fine. You might not have to select that. But if we click View the Details, here it is. Now, I think she lived here, Arcade, which was near El Dorado Street, that portion of Arcade. So it's probably 75-1, but guess what? It's not available yet. That's the census. That's the link they've already put in to take you to the census page. But if you click the other link, it shows you the records that Stephen Morse and Joel Weintraub used to locate these districts. So this is really about what district, what ED number is your address, okay? So that tool tells us this is the ED number, and that will then be able to lead us over to find the map. There's a lot more resources over at stephenmorse.org, so I encourage you to go check that out. On the home page, I use the Alt or Control F so I can do find on page. And I just type in 1950 and you can scroll through all the different links that have information about the 1950 census. Because it's not just in this one section. Some of them are spread out. There is a link there for problems using the 1950 enumeration district maps. Read that. It's really helpful because if you run into some snags as you're doing your preliminary research and preparation, it will probably help explain what challenges you're running into. Because it depends on the area, the geographic area, whether it was an urban city or agricultural, whatever, you might have different issues finding ED maps. Now, as we've talked about in past videos here at Genealogy Gems, it's really important to understand the collection that you're working with because that helps you better interpret what you're looking at, okay? So I just want to touch on a little bit of the history in terms of enumerators. It was really interesting to discover up until 1870, the job of census taker was actually held by the U.S. Marshal. That's interesting. So they didn't go out and hire enumerators. It was just the marshal's job. So have you ever been frustrated trying to find somebody who's not there in a census from 1870 or earlier? Well, it turns out that these U.S. Marshals didn't get a lot of training. They didn't get big training manuals and they didn't even have forms printed until 1830 to use. It was all handwritten. So they had a challenge. It's very possible that mistakes got made or people got missed or whatever because there was just a little lack of training. So in 1879, they had an act of Congress passed and it shifted the job from the marshals to people who were specially hired just to be enumerators. And that was just in time for the 1880 census, which was collecting even more information. In fact, here's Frank Wilkerson. And he was a census enumerator, and I just had to share him with you because he had a few opinions of his neighbors that he was enumerating. So he says that Joe Blah, he's a loafer as his occupation, and that this other guy, I think his name is Coleman, that he's a blowhard. You never know what you'll find in the census. So I digress. Let's talk about these census enumerators a little bit more because one of the interesting things about the 1950 census is it's the last time that enumerators solely met individually in person with the people that they were taking the census of. In 1960, that was when they started mailing out questionnaires. So this is really kind of a last glimpse at a purely in-person, very personal census taking in the United States. So thankfully, they had a whole lot more to work with than the U.S. Marshals of days gone by. And why does this matter to you? It matters because the enumerator instruction booklet explains everything about why they did what they did, why they recorded things the way they did. And it is available. It's a 24-page enumerator instruction booklet that they received. And it's really important for understanding what you're seeing on the page as you look at it. So this is homework that you can do to become more familiar with, and I would really recommend, it's an interesting read anyway, but to just read through it. Because if we see a mark or a notation on this more complicated 1950 form, or maybe they left a field blank, or some other kind of anomaly, well, you need to go to the instructions to understand why that was. Chances are, and I can tell you so many examples of working with the census and seeing something strange or wondering why something was the way it was. And sure enough, when I looked it up in the census enumerator instructions, there was an example and an instruction there for them. So it really gives you the backstory so that you can accurately interpret. It's one thing if these folks did a much better job of getting accurate information collected. But if we're misunderstanding it, I think it kind of does a disservice to the whole process. We have to understand the why. That's kind of my mantra about all of genealogy. If we understand the why behind what we're seeing, what we're looking at, what we're trying to interpret, and build as a case in our genealogy research, we're going to be far more likely to interpret correctly. So this is a really fascinating, and hey, it's free. It's available today. So you can download it at the Census Bureau website. And again, go to my website, genealogygems.com/Elevenses, and click on this episode. Now, this is technically episode 51. You'll see census on the picture, and click that because in the show notes, I've got the links and more information about these instructions. Now, here's a perfect example of why this really matters and why you need the 1950 Census Enumerator instructions. And it's because back in 1940, we started seeing these X's with circles around them. And when you first look at it, you're like, what's he doing? Playing tic-tac-toe? I mean, what's happening? We've never seen these before prior to the 1940 census. Well, if you go to the 1940 census instructions, it says, enter X in a circle after the name of the person furnishing the information. So for the first time, the enumerator was able to talk to us as the interpreter or the genealogist many, many years later to say, hey, it was, Tallulah or Richard who gave me this information about this entire family. And as you look at the family, like we might see here that, now it looks like Otto, and maybe that's Martha, I don't know. The wife in this family gives the information. She's the person that the enumerator is actually talking to. Now we see that Fayed is a brother-in-law. Now this might be her, well, it's the brother-in-law, the head of the household, so it's probably her brother. He's probably not there today. So information about the wife we can see is pretty darn accurate. It must be, well, unless she doesn't want to tell you what her age is. But she's probably pretty accurate about herself. She probably knows if she was naturalized what year that was. But if she's giving the enumerator information about her brother, now that's maybe a little more. We have to just be extra careful to verify that information. And the more people in the family, or if there's boarders who are living there and paying rent, it really matters who gave the information, how well they knew that person, and we don't know if that person was in the house at the time that the enumerator was. So the little notations like this may be popping up in our 1950 census, and we're going to want to understand what they're about. It's also important to understand who does not get enumerated, and the instructions tell us that as well. So here's kind of some of the folks who were going to fall in that do not enumerate category in 1950. People temporarily visiting the household. So I think in earlier, censuses, we found sometimes duplicates. It would be they're staying here, but it's temporary, but they actually have a house over here and you see them twice. They were trying to be very careful not to pick up anybody who doesn't actually permanently reside at that household. Foreign citizens visiting embassies and similar facilities, students below college level who are boarding, and they're boarding to attend school locally. So this sounds like if you wanted your child to go to a better school and they were in, let's say, high school, so you send them to go live with Aunt Martha. So this is this is a student below college level boarding in Aunt Martha's home to attend school locally, but she's not supposed to be enumerated with Aunt Martha because that's not her home. Her residence is with her family. College students visiting but who live elsewhere to attend school. People who eat with the family but don't sleep there. And I suppose there would be people like that. Maybe they just go, it's almost like a hotel situation. domestic workers who don't sleep there. So if somebody is a maid during the day in the house, but they are not a live-in maid, then they need to be enumerated at their own house. Household members who are currently an inmate at a prison or another institution, if they're in a mental institution, a senior living institution, that type of thing. Ship crew members or people who live in lighthouses. It gets very specific. And absent soldiers and sailors. So if, again, you run into situations where you are not coming up with somebody that you think you should, any kind of a situation that it's just not adding up as neatly as you'd like it to, head to the instructions. The enumerator instructions are going to shed light on it most likely. Now, is anybody in your family tree born between January and March of 1950? I was looking in the live chat and I saw that Teresa was excited. She's hoping to find herself as an infant in the 1950 census. Well, if she was born January, February, or March of 1950, then there was a special card completed just for her. And this would be true for any infants in the first 3 months of 1950. So they had this special infant card. And this was completed, and what's really interesting about this is there's almost an entire page in the instruction booklet explaining when this is taken, how it should be filled out, all of that stuff. And I don't know the answer about whether these cards are going to be available. I need to do some more digging because I think it would be interesting to know, and maybe somebody in our live chat knows, if the National Archives has that as another series or if it's going to be attached to the census records. Might just be a special little bonus to look for. But it's important to know that it exists. So if you do have people who were infants in your family at that time, then go check out the instructions for the infant card. So the coverage and completeness in the 1950 census, we're hoping it's going to be better than ever. We might find more complete and accurate information, and part of that is because there were some new procedures put in place. So they had the improved enumerator training, providing enumerators with detailed street maps better than ever. They even published missing person forms in the local newspapers to try to bring out folks who they were looking for. And they set aside a very special night to conduct a special enumeration of people who were in hotels or tourist courts. You've heard of motor courts. When people were motoring around the country, they would stay in these little tents or sheds or little, motor courts. Or if they were transient in any way. And in 1950, that makes a lot of sense because my gosh, we're getting the highway systems. We're getting cars more than ever. The World War II is over. People are on the move. And that posed a really interesting challenge for the enumerators. So counting people, of course, when they're moving around is challenging. They could be counted twice or worse. They could be not counted at all. So census takers made a huge effort to capture these people. And I know when I look through my grandmother's scrapbooks and photo albums, oh my gosh, there was more camping pictures than anything. They were always on the road going camping. And at one point they had rented a little motorhome. So the Census Bureau came up with something called T-night canvases. And you can see there's even photos over at the Census Bureau of all of these different enumerators, men and women, who made the rounds. And they did this really specific, in a very specific way. So T-night, T is for transient. And there were 2 nights set aside. It was April 11th, which was a Tuesday, and April 13th, which was Thursday. And the goal was on those 2 days, that's when we're going to go and just canvass all of these different people who are on the move. So it provided a more accurate count of people who didn't have a fixed address or they were away from home. And there were certainly people who didn't have a fixed address. So Tuesday, April 11th of 1950, now if you go, again, head back to those instructions It says here, quote, an intensive drive to cover in a single night the occupants of certain places usually devoted to transients. So they're talking about hotels, the YMCA, tourist courts. Now, a lot of young men, right, they're back from World War II and they're moving around, and the YMCA was an incredibly popular place to get a really inexpensive but safe place to stay. And so they were saying in 1940, there were more than 100,000 rooms for the YMCA. So that's a lot of people, and sometimes 2 to a room or 3 to a room. So according to the instructions, the enumerators were supposed to visit these facilities between 5 p.m. and 11 p.m., which kind of makes sense because it's check-in time. And then they did it again, 7 a.m. to noon the next morning, check-out time, right? And then on the 13th, they paid attention to missions and flop houses. So T-night enumerators assigned to these facilities, what they were supposed to do was station themselves in the lobby, and they were going to stop people and ask them, if they've been enumerated. They were going to interview people. They had to talk to the guests and the staff who knew the guests as well. So they were using a very special form to do this, and it's called the Individual Census Report Form. It's called an ICR. And this was completed by the person, not the enumerator, which I think is really interesting because most records that we're looking at, these are going to be filled out by the enumerator. But in this case, you're talking about, let's say, the YMCA. And there's a lot of people around. You might even be rooming with a couple of guys. So in order to try to kind of protect their privacy, or if they're at a hotel and they're doing business, they don't want to be talking about what's your income and then writing it down. So they would hand them the form, the ICR form. And you can see here, this is a letter from the National Archives talking about the American Hotel Association, kind of preparing their associated hotels about what this was going to be happening. These people were going to be in the lobby doing all of this. And these guys worked hard. So they had to stop people in the lobby and say, hey, did you fill out the ICR? They're on the guest phone calling the rooms. They are talking to the staff. And so there was a really big effort. Even with all of that, not every person got captured on an ICR. So what they would do in those cases is they would sit down with the staff with the hotel register, and they would fill in that information. So here's your tip. If you see REG in caps in the 1950 census, you're really looking at, they didn't talk to your ancestor. They got his information or her information from the register of the place where they were staying. And again, that's discussed in the instructions. There's also a couple of new things that came out. There was something called a residential survey, and this is what it looks like. I don't know a lot about it, but I just know that it was for residential financing. It was a separate survey that they did in 1950, and it was information collected on a sample basis from owners of owner-occupied and rental properties and mortgage lenders. So it'll be interesting to see if that surfaces in any way or if we're able to get our hands on that. And technology was changing too. According to the National Archives, quote, the Census Bureau began use of the first non-military computer shortly after completing the 1950 enumeration. It was called UNIVAC. You probably heard of that, the Universal Automatic Computer. And it was the first of a series, was delivered in 1951, and it helped tabulate some of the statistics of the 1954 economic censuses. It weighed 16,000 pounds and had 5,000 vacuum tubes. Remember when you had to call the TV repairman to come and change the tubes in your TV? Oh my gosh, I wouldn't want to be in charge of that. UNIVAC. Okay, so to wrap this up, I want to tell you 5 things, concrete things that you could be doing right now and over the next year in preparation for the 1950 census in 2022. First of all, get into your family tree. If you have a genealogy software database, an online tree, go back and review it. Make a list of those families that you want to look up who fall within 1950. And look for gaps and questions that you might be able to answer based on what you've learned in this hour together on what kind of information is provided. A good research question, we've talked about that here before at our channel, is just key to getting good answers. So make that list, go through, take some time to comb through your family tree. Now, you also want to look up for addresses. You might have some of those addresses already in your database, but if you don't, once you've got your list of people, now you've got some homework to do. We need to go find their address in 1950. It's going to make it so much easier to find the right ED so that you can then find them in the unindexed records even before it gets indexed. Who wants to wait 8 months or however long it's going to be? I don't know how long it's going to be to get the index and the searchability. So look at old letters and diaries and journals and scrapbooks and photo albums around your house. Talk to your relatives. Maybe they've got an old Rolodex or address book. You can look at vital records. The birth, marriage, and death records might have some addresses, maybe where somebody passed away on a death record. Check the newspaper, Social Security, and even make note. Go back and look at your 1940 census for that family. What was the address? Maybe they didn't move. So now you're ready to go. You've got names and people and addresses. Also, you can use the one-step website that we talked about. And once you're armed with these locations and these addresses, you're ready to go out and find those enumeration district numbers. So you're going to use the tools. I've got links very specifically throughout the show notes with all the details how to. And you're going to enter the state and the town where they lived. If you have the street address, you're going to enter that more specifically in that unified tool. And you're going to then get the map, and you're going to find that address on the map. And remember, the drawing, the orange lines are the district lines, and then there's going to be a big number in there, and that's going to tell you what ED number that they are in. And I do encourage you to read that essay that's over at Stephen Morse's website, Problems with the 1950 ED Maps. It's going to help save you from some frustration, okay? And here's what's really important. The one-step tool includes some maps that are not found at the National Archives. That's why you need that tool, okay? It's easier to use, but it's also going to get into maps that the National Archives doesn't have. All right, and then we're going to take some time as you're waiting and go check back and make sure you've filled in the blanks for all the other census records that you should have. Right now, publicly, we have 1790 through 1940, and those are available online. You can find them at all the big genealogy websites. Family Search has them. FamilySearch.org has them for free. The National Archives has them. The National Archives has a great resource page over at their site, and it lists the decennial census and all the associated online resources for it. So I've got a link in the show notes to that for you as well. And that's going to help you, census by census, kind of make determinations where the best place is to find the records. And of course, for 1940, if you haven't already done it, go check out the enumeration district maps for 1940. I just think they're interesting to have anyway, right? I love putting those into Google Earth as a map overlay. I talk about that in my book because it's just one more piece of their life and their context of their life. And you can also check out the 20 tips for, I think this is probably 6 items, the 20 tips for census research at the National Archives. It's called the History Hub, and it's a great article about just general tips for researching in the census. So that link, my friends, is in the show notes. Where are the show notes? One more time, we go to genealogygems.com, and you will find, typically I will have the picture of the most recent episode on the homepage. I'll have to check and make sure I got this one on the homepage. You can always go in the menu to Elevenses, and on mobile, the menu is the 3 horizontal lines, and you click that, and then on your phone, you'll be able to get to the Elevenses menu as well. So my goodness gracious, we've covered so much. Who knew that there was so much when it comes to the 1950 census? And I know, Karen, well, this is actually the 51st episode. She mentioned it's the 50th episode of Elevenses with Lisa. And I think that was our week last week. I couldn't believe it. It just blew right past me. So thank you. She says, I call it the pandemic blessing as it has helped us look forward to something every week. It has been a blessing for me as well. And we'll continue to do it because there's so much to learn. And it is so fun to get together with each other, right? And have our little cuppa. Yeah. Steve says, hey, time to pull out those city directories. Absolutely. You guys have a whole checklist of stuff. Be sure, premium members, that you go in and you download the PDF of the show notes. It's really your go-to cheat sheet for this one. And I wanted to mention, let's see if this works. Happy birthday, Grandma. My grandma, who lived in the 1950s, who was such a card, Grandma Burkett, today is her 108th birthday. No, she's been long gone for a couple of decades. But she was my inspiration in many ways and just had it down pat, how to just love on a kid. And that's what she did for me. I hope you have a wonderful week, my friend. You have lots to do this week. We're going to probably be looking even more in depth at some of the enumeration district maps, things you can do with them. So stay tuned to the Genealogy Gems YouTube channel because this is where it's going to happen. The more I got into this, the more I realized I really want to show you this in step by step, and I want to show you how to make the overlays. We'll be doing that in future videos. So will you please do two things? Click the red subscribe button and tell your friends about the channel. Share it on Facebook. Let people know, oh my gosh, we are doing so much over here. We want you to join us. I hope you will. All right. Well, I think that's it for me. What have I got here? That's it. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. I know you will. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.